Every evening, me with a tray in the corner, like a dog. He said I was not smart enough to be one of them. And then it turned out I wasn't his son at all, and he knew this from birth. The routine never changed. 6 o'clock sharp, the family would gather around our oak dining table. My younger brother would slide into his usual chair, the one with the soft cushion that Mom had sewn herself. My father would take his place at the head, newspapers folded beside his plate. Mom would serve everyone, making sure their portions were generous and warm. And me? I'd stand in the corner by the kitchen doorway, balancing a plastic tray that held whatever scraps were left. Sometimes it was cold meatloaf from 2 nights ago, sometimes just bread and butter. The corner had become my permanent dining spot over the years, worn into the linoleum floor where I'd shift my weight from foot to foot, trying to make the meal last as long as possible. My father would glance over occasionally, shaking his head with that familiar look of disgust, the same expression he'd worn since I could remember. He'd mutter things under his breath about how I wasn't deserving of sitting with the real family, how I was too slow, too awkward, too much of an embarrassment to share their space. My brother never questioned it. He was 3 years younger, but everything I wasn't. Confident in his school clothes, quick with jokes that made our parents laugh, comfortable in his own skin in ways that seemed impossible to me. He'd chat about his day, his friends, his plans for the weekend, while I tried to make myself invisible in that corner. The worst part wasn't the standing or the cold food. It was the silence that followed me everywhere. In that corner, I became a ghost in my own home. Conversations would flow around me like I wasn't there, like I was just another piece of furniture they'd grown used to ignoring. School wasn't much better. I'd sit alone at lunch, picking at sandwiches made from whatever was left in our fridge. Other kids would laugh and joke at their tables, but something about me seemed to repel friendship. Maybe it was the way I carried myself, hunched over like I was apologizing for existing. Maybe it was how I never quite knew what to say when someone did try to talk to me. The teachers treated me like I was slow, even though my grades were decent. Not great, but decent. Average. But average felt like failure when you're constantly reminded that you're not measuring up to some invisible standard. Every parent-teacher conference ended the same way, with my father sighing heavily and shaking his head, telling me I needed to try harder, be better, stop being such a disappointment. Nights were the hardest. After dinner, the family would move to the living room to watch TV together. They'd sprawl across the couch, sharing popcorn and commenting on whatever show was on. I'd retreat to my room, which was really just the converted basement space. No windows, just concrete walls and a twin bed that creaked every time I moved. I'd lie there listening to their laughter filtering down through the ceiling, wondering what was wrong with me. Why couldn't I be like my brother? Why couldn't I make them proud? Why did my very existence seem to irritate my father so much? The questions followed me into my teenage years. I grew taller but somehow felt smaller. My voice cracked and changed, but I used it less and less. Speaking up had never gotten me anywhere good, so I learned to keep my thoughts to myself. Update 1. High school brought new challenges. My brother was becoming popular, joining sports teams, and getting invited to parties. I watched from the sidelines as he effortlessly navigated social situations that terrified me. At home, the dinner routine continued unchanged. Me in the corner, them at the table, the invisible wall between us growing thicker each day. I started working part-time at a local grocery store, bagging groceries and collecting carts from the parking lot. The work was simple, mindless, but it gave me somewhere to be that wasn't home. My coworkers were nice enough, treating me like a normal person instead of some kind of burden. For a few hours each day, I could pretend I was just another teenager earning pocket money. But every evening, I'd return to that corner. The plastic tray, the cold food, the whispered comments about how I was lucky they even fed me at all. My mother had always been quiet during these moments. She'd serve everyone else first, then bring me my portion without making eye contact. Sometimes I caught her watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Sadness, maybe? Guilt? I couldn't tell. She never spoke up when my father would go on his rants about my worthlessness. The breaking point came during my senior year. I'd been accepted to a community college, nothing fancy, but it was something. When I told my father over dinner, he laughed. Actually laughed. Not the kind of laugh that comes from joy, but the bitter, mocking kind that cuts deep. He said I was wasting everyone's time, that I'd never amount to anything anyway, so why bother pretending? My brother shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and for a moment I thought he might say something. But he didn't. Nobody did. That night, I made a decision. I was 17, almost 18, and I was done. Done with the corner, done with the tray, done with being treated like some kind of unwanted pet. I started making plans to leave as soon as I graduated. I began saving every penny from my grocery store job. I found a tiny studio apartment across town, barely bigger than a closet, but it had a real kitchen table, just big enough for one person. I imagined eating my meals there, sitting down like a normal human being, without anyone watching me with disgust. The months crawled by. I counted down the days until graduation, until I could finally escape that corner and start over somewhere else. I fantasized about walking away and never looking back, about becoming someone completely different in a place where nobody knew my history. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. Update 2. 3 weeks before graduation, everything changed. I was in my basement room, packing my few belongings into cardboard boxes, when I heard shouting upstairs. My parents were fighting, which wasn't unusual, but this time it was different. Louder. More desperate. I crept up the stairs, staying in the shadows by the kitchen doorway. The same spot where I'd eaten countless meals, but now I was there for a different reason. My mother was crying. Really crying in a way I'd never seen before. Her voice was thick with tears and anger. She was screaming about lies, about years of pretending, about how she couldn't do it anymore. My father was yelling back, but his voice had a defensive edge I'd never heard. They were throwing words at each other like weapons, each one designed to hurt. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. My mother's voice, cutting through the chaos with perfect clarity. She was telling him that she couldn't watch him torture an innocent kid anymore, that I had never done anything to deserve the treatment I'd received. My father's response hit me like a physical blow. He said he'd known from the beginning that I wasn't his son, known from the day I was born, known when he looked at me in the hospital and saw features that didn't match his or my mother's, known when the timing didn't add up quite right. The room started spinning. I gripped the doorframe to keep from falling, my heart hammering so hard I was sure they'd hear it. Everything suddenly made sense. The corner, the cold meals, the constant disappointment, the way he looked at me like I was some kind of intruder. I wasn't his son. I was living proof of my mother's betrayal, a daily reminder of her infidelity. And he'd been punishing me for it my entire life. My mother was still crying, begging him to stop taking his anger out on me. She said she'd told him the truth years ago, that she'd tried to make things right, but he'd insisted on keeping me and making me pay for her mistakes. The conversation continued, but I couldn't process any more words. I stumbled back down to my room, my legs shaking, my mind reeling. 17 years of my life suddenly made horrible sense. I wasn't broken or defective or worthless. I was just a reminder of something my father couldn't forgive. I sat on my bed in the dark, staring at the boxes I'd packed. Moving out had felt like escape before, but now it felt like something else entirely. It felt like freedom I'd never known I deserved. The next morning, neither of my parents mentioned the fight. Breakfast happened the same way it always did, with me standing in my corner, but now I understood why. My father couldn't even look at me directly. My mother kept glancing my way with red-rimmed eyes. I went to work that day in a daze, mechanically bagging groceries and pushing carts. My coworkers asked if I was feeling okay, but I couldn't explain what had happened. How do you tell someone that you've just learned your entire life has been built on a lie? That evening, I didn't go home right away. I drove around town for hours, past the high school, past the community college where I'd planned to start in the fall, past the grocery store where I'd spent so many evenings. Everything looked the same, but I felt completely different. When I finally pulled into our driveway, I saw my mother waiting on the front porch. She'd never done that before. As I walked toward the house, she stood up and walked over to me. For the first time in years, she looked directly into my eyes. Update 3. My mother's confession came in whispers on that front porch, under the dim light of our old lamp. She told me about a brief relationship she'd had during a rough patch in her marriage, how she'd thought it was over between her and my father, how she'd realized she was pregnant and initially wasn't sure who the father was. She'd hoped I was my father's child, she said. Really hoped. But as I grew older, the physical differences became obvious. My father had confronted her when I was about 3 years old, demanding the truth. She'd admitted everything, expecting him to leave or throw us both out. Instead, he'd made a different choice. He decided to keep me, but make sure I knew I wasn't really part of the family. It was his way of having his revenge while maintaining the appearance of being a good man who'd raised another man's child. She'd gone along with it, she said, because she was scared. Scared of being a single mother, scared of losing her home, scared of the shame that would come with everyone knowing what she'd done. So she'd watched silently as her husband systematically destroyed her son's self-worth, year after year. The conversation lasted hours. She told me about my biological father, a man I'd never met who'd moved away before I was born. She tried to contact him a few times over the years, but never got a response. She wasn't even sure if he knew I existed. As she talked, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger at her for letting the abuse continue. Relief that I finally understood why nothing I did was ever good enough. Sadness for the childhood I'd lost. But also something else, something I hadn't expected. Hope. For the first time in my life, the problem wasn't me. I wasn't defective or stupid or worthless. I was just caught in the middle of someone else's broken relationship, paying the price for decisions I'd had no part in making. My mother apologized over and over, tears streaming down her face. She said she'd been a coward, that she should have protected me, that she should have left years ago. She begged me to forgive her, to give her a chance to make things right. I didn't know what to say. 17 years of damage doesn't disappear with an apology, no matter how sincere. But sitting there on that porch, looking at this woman who'd failed me so completely, I also saw someone who was genuinely broken by what she'd allowed to happen. The next few weeks passed in a blur. My father barely acknowledged that anything had changed. He still expected me to stand in the corner during meals, still muttered his usual criticisms. But now I understood that his hatred had nothing to do with me personally. It was about his own pain, his own humiliation, his own inability to forgive. I finished high school and graduated with my class. My mother came to the ceremony, sitting by herself in the back row. My father and brother didn't show up. I walked across that stage knowing I was walking away from everything I'd ever known. The day I moved out, my mother helped me carry my boxes to the car. She'd written down contact information for my biological father, information she'd been holding on to for years. She said she'd understand if I never wanted to see her again, but hoped I might consider giving her a chance to be a real mother someday. Final update. Moving into that tiny studio apartment felt like stepping into a different world. The first night, I sat at my small kitchen table to eat dinner. Just me, a chair, and a proper plate. No corner, no plastic tray, no one watching me with disgust. The silence was different now. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of being ignored. It was peaceful. I contacted my biological father through social media. It took several attempts, but he eventually responded. He'd known about me, he said, but had been young and scared when my mother told him she was pregnant. He'd convinced himself that running away was the best thing for everyone involved. We met for coffee on a Saturday morning in late summer. He looked like me, or rather, I looked like him. Same eyes, same nose, same way of holding our shoulders. Sitting across from him felt surreal, like looking into a mirror that showed me what I might have been if I'd grown up in a different house. He wasn't perfect. He'd made mistakes, hurt people, struggled with his own demons. But he was genuinely curious about me, interested in who I'd become despite everything. He asked about my plans, my hopes, my dreams. Questions no one had ever bothered to ask before. I started community college that fall, studying business administration. Nothing glamorous, but it was something I'd chosen for myself. My grades were better than they'd ever been in high school. Turns out it's easier to focus when you're not constantly being told you're not smart enough. My mother and I began meeting for lunch once a month. Slow, careful conversations where we tried to figure out how to be related to each other. She'd started standing up to my father, she told me. Small things at first, then bigger ones. She was considering leaving him, starting over somewhere else. My brother reached out to me around Christmas. He'd been accepted to a prestigious university and wanted to tell me the news. During our conversation, he admitted that he'd always known something was wrong with how I was treated, but he'd been too scared to speak up. He was ashamed of his silence, he said. I didn't forgive everyone immediately. Forgiveness turned out to be a process, not a single moment. Some days I was angry. Some days I was sad. Some days I felt nothing at all. But gradually, I began to understand that my worth as a person had never been determined by how I was treated in that house. The corner where I'd eaten all those meals became a symbol of something else entirely. Not shame or rejection, but survival. I'd endured 17 years of psychological abuse and come out the other side with my humanity intact. That was something to be proud of, not ashamed of. I never saw my father again after I moved out. He made no attempt to contact me, and I felt no need to contact him. Some relationships are too damaged to repair, and that's okay. Not every story has to end with reconciliation. But I did learn something important from all those years in that corner. I learned that how people treat you says more about them than it does about you. I learned that family isn't always the people you're born to, but the people who choose to love you as you are. And I learned that sometimes the greatest act of self-respect is simply walking away from people who refuse to see your worth. I'd spent 17 years trying to earn a place at a table where I was never truly welcome. Now I had my own table, in my own home, where I could sit with dignity and eat in peace. The corner had taught me to make myself small, to apologize for existing, to accept crumbs when I deserved a full meal. But it had also taught me something else, something my father never intended. It taught me that I was stronger than I knew, that I could endure far more than most people ever have to, and that survival itself is a form of victory. Sometimes I still think about that corner, about the plastic tray and the cold food and the years of silence. But now when I remember it, I see it differently. I see a young man who refused to be broken, who kept his heart open despite everything, who never stopped believing that somewhere, somehow, there had to be a better way to live. I was right. There was.